Well, again, for our hermeneutics class, we have covered quite a bit so far. We've talked about the history of hermeneutics, right? And last week we began looking at the first two of the three biblical contexts of proper hermeneutics, right? Last week we talked about literary context, right? Looking at what is in the text itself, studying the passages before and after the scripture that we're looking at, right? We also talked about historical context, right? Looking around the text and studying the historical settings and names and places and cultures and backgrounds of all these texts, right? So we've covered literary, we've covered historical, and these truly are two pillars of ethical and legitimate interpretation. But today, we're going to be thinking about Christological context. Christological context. What do we mean by this? Well, this is what Dr. Piotrowski likes to say is looking through the text, taking a step back from the individual trees and seeing how they function in God's overarching story of redemption, right? How the whole Bible is held together and unified in the singular story of Jesus Christ himself, right? Christological context. As we begin, I think it's important for us to understand from the outset that Jesus himself affirmed a Christological reading of Scripture. If Jesus affirms it, we should too, right? Amen, somebody. Amen, somebody. If Jesus affirms it, we should too. Jesus himself understood that the entire redemptive story of God hinged upon his life and ministry. All right, listen to the words of Jesus, starting in John chapter 5, verse 37. You can turn there if you want to. John 5, verse 37. He says this to the evil Jews and religious leaders of Israel during that day. John 5:37, and the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard. His form you have never seen. And you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he has sent. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. How many scriptures did they have up to that point? Probably just an Old Testament, right? Just an Old Testament. Yet here Jesus says it was they, those very scriptures that you have, that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. Verse 45, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father, Jesus says. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So we see this throughout the Gospels, right? Jesus' life and ministry is just attacked with pressure and ridicule from the Jewish leaders, right? The religious authorities of the day. They call him a heretic, they call him a liar, false teacher. Yet when Christ rebukes them, he doesn't just say, you need to believe me. Believe me, believe me. He points them to the scriptures. He points them to the Old Testament, essentially saying, you should know better because I am the climax of your holy book. Right? This is how Jesus defends his authority. Look at the scriptures. Turn with me to Luke 24. Luke 24. This is after Christ's death and burial, resurrection. Remember, he was rebuking his disciples for their lack of faith. Luke 24, starting in verse 25. And he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He goes on in verse 44. Then he said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. All right, so what does he mean by this phrase, "in all the Scriptures"? Right? Notice Luke writes, beginning from Moses and all the prophets. That's another way of saying the Old Testament, the entirety of the Old Testament, right? The law, the prophets, and the writings. We would say these are the Scriptures. And so Christ starts from the very beginning with Moses to reveal to his disciples the things concerning himself therein. Right? Now, is he saying that every single word of the Old Testament has some sort of mystical Jesus connection? No, I don't think so. I wrote a couple of hypothetical examples. Every time you read Philistine, you're supposed to think of Jesus filling our hearts with the Spirit. No, we're not doing that. Every time you read about the land in the Old Testament, we're supposed to think Christ's Spirit landing on his disciples at Pentecost. No, that's bad interpretation. We're not doing that. No, I don't think so. That would be allegory. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Allegory. But I don't think that he means every single verse is directly associated with him in some mystical way. But I also don't think it means that Jesus, in this example of Luke 24, went through the entire Old Testament to the disciples and just kind of hand-selected 3 or 4 psalms that are kind of about him, and that was it. No, I think it's important for us to understand that, yes, both specific individual passages as well as the overall themes and trajectories of the Old Testament find their fulfillment in the person and work of Christ. It's a both and, right? This is where I want to steal from my friend and teacher, Dr. Piotrowski, for a minute when it comes to understanding the macro structure of the Bible as a whole, the structure of Scripture as a whole. And I'm convinced, as I think you should be as well, that the Old Testament is Christotelic. The Old Testament is Christotelic. The New Testament is Christocentric. Those are different terms, right? We'll talk about them. The New Testament is Christocentric. And the whole Bible, then, is Christological. The Bible is Christological. You've got the handout there with some, I thought, helpful graphics to kind of break these down. So the Old Testament, let's start with that. The Old Testament is Christotelic, meaning that the 39 books of the Old Testament are like a steady incline towards the coming of Christ. Telos, the end, the goal of the Old Testament is Christ. The entire story is a trajectory toward the Lord. So no, not every single word or verse has a direct one-to-one connection to Jesus, but every word and verse is one small stream flowing into a messianic river of anticipation, right? It's all going somewhere, and it's toward Christ. So the Old Testament is Christotelic. This is a quote from the book, In All the Scriptures. He says, "In Jesus' mind, all the Scriptures have to do with him. Jesus understood that every author of the Old Testament wrote with a slant toward his ministry, and that this is demonstrable from the pages of the Old Testament itself. This is no retrospective reinterpretation of the Old Testament, therefore, but the Old Testament itself, from beginning to end, is climbing to the coming of Christ." End quote. Now again, the rest of our class, this hermeneutics class, is going to be working through different sections and genres of Scripture, so we'll see all sorts of examples. But I do want to give us one, probably the most fundamental example there is, Genesis 3:15, right? The proto-euangelion, the first gospel, Genesis 3:15, right? Where God